What's up guys, Enkiri here. And in honor of Form Check Friday, I thought it would be cool to start a new video series where we analyze the lifting technique of popular fitness YouTubers. We'll cover the good, the bad, and the ugly on some of my personal favorite compound exercises. So we'll look at squats, deadlifts, overhead presses, push presses, power cleans, and power snatches, or whatever. I still need to research some more footage from different YouTubers, but I do have a few ideas of different lifters that I want to analyze off the top of my head already, including but not limited to Johnny Candido, Eric Bugenhagen, Scott Herman, and even James Linker from Shredded Sports Science. Oh, well, never mind, that last one is going to be impossible to do because that footage doesn't actually exist, so just forget I said that. But anyway, moving on. Today we're going to kick the series off with some heavy deadlifts from my favorite strength coach, the one and only Jeff Cavalier of Athlean-X.com. So let's check out the footage and break this thing down. If we take a look at the set he does with 4 plates on the bar, we're actually able to observe a pretty solid setup right before the pull begins. The hips are probably a tad bit lower than they need to be, and we can just kind of see instinctively that from his body positions relative to the barbell, that as soon as he begins pulling, the hips are going to pop up, at least a little bit. But overall, this isn't too bad of a setup. The shoulders are positioned just in front of the barbell, which is necessary for breaking the bar off the floor, although they may be a bit too far forward in this instance. The shoulders are also in a pretty good set position relative to the hips, with the hips in a pretty good set position relative to the knees. As I said a second ago, perhaps a tad bit lower than they need to be, but nothing that I'm going to nitpick at until I actually see the lift in action. And lastly, the back is in a braced and relatively neutral position, which is another plus. Now here's where we get to some of the problems with this setup, and really there are just 2 main issues present here. For one, the position of the head. Personally, I don't typically concern myself with head positioning like this unless it's particularly egregious, which I wouldn't consider this to be, at least not in this particular instance. It does tend to ebb and flow over the course of his sets though, so this is going to be something to watch out for. But still, some coaches find this to be a big deal, and so I would be remiss if I didn't mention it. But with the head looking up like that and leaving the neck in a position of flexion rather than a neutral position, you can potentially strain those muscles, leading to chronic neck pain over time, so that's just something to note. The second issue, which is a much larger issue, is that he's setting up too close to the barbell. He pulls his hips down to help get the legs involved in the initial pull off the floor. However, because his shins are too close to the barbell, that means that when the ankles are dorsiflexed, either the barbell will have to be pushed forward to make room for the shins to move forward, or the hips will have to be pushed down and backwards away from the barbell rather than just straight down, which is what he does to finish his setup. The hips are the center of mass though, so moving them farther away from the bar than they need to be is a position of compromised mechanical leverage and is inevitably going to lead to inefficiencies as soon as the lift begins. We can easily spot this setup error by noting the position of the arms as well as looking at the position of the barbell relative to the feet. Here, the barbell is situated towards the back third of the foot as he stands over it, barely forward of the shins, when it should be positioned over the middle of the foot instead. This is going to cause a backward shifting of the weight, which is an imbalanced position that is suboptimal for force production. We can see this as when he lifts the bar, his weight often rocks backwards onto his heels, with his toes even coming off the ground at some points. Also, in the set position, rather than hanging straight down in a position perpendicular to the floor as they should be, the arms are actually slanted back towards the body, indicating that the barbell is too close to the body. The lats will not be strong enough to maintain this excessively extended position once the stress of the weight is imposed upon them. Therefore, Either the hips are going to be forced to rise to compensate for this poor set position, thereby pulling the shins back, subsequently removing the slant in the arms, or the barbell must be allowed to drift forwards when it's pulled off the floor, in which case it likely will not break the floor unless you have freakishly strong legs. Either way, this is not an ideal position to be in for optimal deadlifting mechanics, either in terms of strength, hypertrophy, or safety, primarily in regards to the lower back. And here's where the cascade begins. For one thing, the pull is initiated by jerking against the barbell rather than by first removing the slack from the bar or by simply smoothly applying force against it. This action can be jarring to the lower back as well as the connective tissue in the elbows. Next, as we speculated would happen based on the setup position, the hips pop up pretty dramatically as soon as force is applied to the barbell. This phenomenon actually first rears its head on the warm-up set where he's using just 2 plates, and then it gradually becomes more and more egregious from there with each successive set that he does until the set with 5 plates, which is basically just a stiff-legged deadlift at that point. This error removes the legs from the equation almost entirely and places a disproportionate amount of strain on the lower back, diminishing the overall training effect and increasing the potential negative stress of the lift. It's also simply inefficient from a mechanical standpoint and is going to reduce the amount of weight that can be safely lifted. The ironic part is that the second rep that he does on both the set with 4 plates as well as the set with 5 plates is actually pretty much perfect. The hips and shoulders rise in unison as they should, with the stress of the weight remaining evenly distributed across the muscles of the legs, hip, and back. And there are actually 2 reasons why he is able to do this on the second rep each time, but not on the first rep. The first reason is pretty obvious in that he's doing touch and go deadlifts here with a pretty aggressive bounce off the floor. This bounce removes the need to overcome inertia against a dead stop object and aids in the acceleration of the barbell off the floor, which is the most mechanically disadvantageous point of the lift, as well as the point in the lift where the legs are called upon to help get the bar moving and break it off the floor. Now, it is a little known fact that quadriceps weakness can actually be a major contributor to the hips popping up prematurely and causing an uneven rising of the hips relative to the shoulders during both squats and deadlifts. And so, on the first rep, since he doesn't have the aid of bouncing the barbell off the floor, the hips actually shoot up in part because the quads are not strong enough to overcome inertia and handle the load that's on the barbell. Therefore, the hips pop up to help the quads escape the lift and let the relatively stronger lower back attempt to handle the load instead. On the second rep, however, with the aid of the bounce off the floor dramatically contributing to the acceleration of the barbell during the weakest point of the lift, the stress imposed on the quads at this point is greatly reduced, and they're therefore actually able to sufficiently handle the load in this case, allowing him to hold a much more ideal body position throughout the remainder of the lift. And the second reason why his second rep is so much better than his first rep requires us to look a little bit more closely at the position of the barbell relative to his body from rep to rep. As I noted during the setup portion of the analysis, the barbell is too close to his body here when he is preparing to pull the first rep off the floor, leading to the cascade of events we just discussed. However, if we note the position of the barbell on the floor during the first rep and compare it to the position of the barbell on the floor during the second rep, we can see that the bar has actually shifted forwards a little bit from its original position. Probably just an inch or 2, but this is still significant as he is now in a position of optimal mechanical leverage. And as a result, and in stark contrast to the first rep, he's able to maintain much better positioning throughout the remainder of the lift because of it, in turn allowing the stress of the weight to remain evenly distributed across the applicable muscles without overtaxing or overburdening the lower back. If he could learn to hold this proper body position from rep to rep without bouncing the bar off the floor, then you would be able to lift more weight in total, lift that weight more safely, and achieve a more balanced and potent training effect on the body. The problem is that this is impossible to achieve when you're bouncing the bar off the floor from rep to rep. Not only are you shortchanging the overall training effect by removing the hardest portion of the lift for every single rep that you do except for the very first, but you're also creating a scenario where you can never fix the problem that's been created, because instead of ever encountering the weakness head on, you're simply avoiding it as often as possible. And you're also creating a situation where your technique is always going to be wildly inconsistent because the bounce off the floor is unpredictable. And we can see here that when going from rep to rep, the bar hits the floor unevenly and as a result rises unevenly as well, which, safety concerns notwithstanding, is highly suboptimal as far as motor learning goes. And that's not to say that touch and go deadlifts are something that should never be done, because there's certainly scenarios where they have their place. For one thing, in a max reps competition in strongman or CrossFit, this would be unavoidable if you had any desire to win. But lifting this way is an advanced technique, and it should be viewed as such. And it certainly shouldn't be the only way you train the deadlift, even if you're proficient at utilizing it both safely and correctly. The problem here, though, is that he's not utilizing it either safely or correctly. His bounce off the floor is both asymmetrical and inconsistent from rep to rep, and clearly jarring on his body. He also loses tightness as he prepares to slingshot the bar off the floor, which is another no-no. Lastly, as he exhibits during the first rep of every set, his deadlift technique is nowhere near solid or proficient enough under normal dead stop circumstances to give him the pass of practicing touch and go deadlifting. As the bar continues to rise, we can see a moderate amount of hip shifting and pelvic rotation, as well as some minor play at the left knee going on, both during the concentric and the eccentric phases, indicating some potential issues with the left hip. This makes sense as these issues tend to go hand in hand with each other, but this isn't the best camera angle to analyze those aspects, so I won't dive too deeply into them. But suffice it to say, they do exist and they should be probed a bit further if maintaining balance between the left and right side of the body is a concern. As the bar crosses the knees, we can see it drift forward a fairly moderate amount in order to get it out of the way of the knees and complete the transition without running into them. This issue is especially prevalent on the right side, which is the side with the supinated hand. This is a common issue with the mixed grip, as it's more difficult in general to achieve proper lat activation when the arm is supinated, and strong lat engagement is in large part what helps keep the barbell tight and tethered to the body for the duration of the lift. However, as we will see in just 1 minute when we get to the lockout portion of the lift, part of what's actually happening here is also a failure to engage the posterior chain during this crucial transitional phase of the lift. Its strong leg drive is what overcomes inertia and gets the bar moving off the floor. The hamstrings then take over and do the brunt of the work from mid-shin until the bar crosses the knee, and then when the bar crosses the knee, the glutes and upper back take over to finish the lift. Now, this is a simplified version of the muscular activation sequence that takes place during the different phases of a deadlift, but it is sufficient to illustrate the issue that we run into here. In this case, as we noted earlier, the legs were unable to do their job during the initial phase of the lift. However, rather than phasing themselves out entirely, at that point, they instead hung around during the transitional portion, as evidenced by the slight bend in the knees throughout the duration of the lift. Since the quadriceps muscles act as antagonists to the hamstring muscles, this slight knee bend prevents maximal engagement of the hamstrings during this transitional phase, as well as forces the barbell to drift forwards in order to clear the knee when it should be moving straight up and down or even in a slightly backwards arc. Both of these aspects are highly suboptimal. Then, when the bar actually does clear the knees subsequently shift forward once again, preventing the glutes and upper back from taking over and locking out the barbell properly. This is very easy to see in the fully locked out position, as the knees remain in a soft, slightly bent position with the hips having never reached full extension and the lower back instead overextending to maintain balance and compensating for this lack of hip extension. Instead of this, the knees should be locked out with the quads flexed hard. The hips should be in a fully extended position with a corresponding maximal contraction of the glutes. The lower back should be neutral rather than an extension, and the scapula should be pulled back via contraction of the upper back muscles rather than simply tilted backwards by pushing the knees forward and extending the lower back backwards. This soft knee position not only puts undue stress on the segments of the lower back, but it would also lead to red lights in a powerlifting competition. In conclusion, there's a lot going on here that is really not ideal. The weight on the bar is simply too heavy for the most part, and the overall mechanics and motor pattern displayed here are just not dialed in enough to merit the inclusion of these heavier sets that were shown. If this were my client, we would have stopped increasing the weight on the bar after the set with 3 plates, and we would focus on gradually building up from there by using a proper training program with adherence to the principle of progressive overload. We would cut the bullshit touch and go reps out immediately and only consider re-implementing them down the road when lifting technique has vastly improved. And even then, we would only consider doing so if we had a particular reason or need for doing so. Lastly, we would be sure to fix the flaws in the muscular activation sequence and always pay attention to the compensatory patterns displayed here to make sure they never got out of control. By lowering the weight, stopping the touch and go reps, and focusing on a handful of beneficial external cues with just a little bit of diligence and a whole lot of hard work, I would wager that in a few short months we would be able to far surpass the numbers shown here, and we would be able to do so with much better, more efficient, and safer lifting technique while demonstrating far fewer compensatory patterns and a far more ideal sequence of muscular activation and engagement. As it stands here today though, I give Athlean-X's deadlifting technique just 2 out of 5 stars. He got some things right, but there's a hell of a lot of room for improvement. Anyway, that's all I got for today, guys. Please be sure to like the video, or you can dislike it. I don't really give a shit, but don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and definitely leave me some love in the comments down below. Keep training hard, and I'll catch you guys next time.